The Whitmore estate rose like a fortress of wealth on the edge of Manhattan, its glass towers and manicured gardens whispering of power and untouchable privilege. Behind those shining walls lived Richard Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight across Wall Street, boardrooms, and the gilded circles of high society. Yet all the riches and influence that defined him could not shield his family from what was quietly unfolding inside his home. His only daughter, Emily Whitmore, just 17, had fallen ill. What began as fatigue and sudden fainting spells escalated into something far more sinister. Doctors came and went, the best specialists money could buy, yet none of them could provide answers, let alone a cure. For those who believed the wealthy lived lives free of pain, this would be a rude awakening. And for those who doubted the strength of voices rarely heard, this story would change everything. Because the help Emily needed was not going to come from an elite physician or a groundbreaking treatment. It would come from someone whose presence in the mansion was hardly noticed, someone the family saw only as part of the background of their privileged lives. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable journey of courage and unexpected redemption, make sure to subscribe. Stories like this remind us that real strength often rises from the most unexpected places, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Grace Johnson was not born into luxury. She grew up beneath the heavy Georgia sun, in a small wooden house where cracked paint revealed years of endurance and love. Raised by her grandmother, a midwife respected in her community, Grace absorbed lessons of patience, observation, and quiet strength. Her grandmother taught her that healing often required more listening than speaking, more attention than action. These lessons, seemingly small at the time, would one day place Grace at the very center of a storm in which billions of dollars and a young girl's life hung in the balance. When Grace arrived in New York, she carried little more than a worn suitcase and a heart full of determination. The city greeted her with its usual chaos, blaring horns, rushing footsteps, skyscrapers blotting out the horizon, but also with opportunities. After weeks of searching, she landed a job at the Whitmore estate. On paper, it was simple domestic work, cleaning, laundry, assisting in the kitchen. In reality, it was an unspoken reminder of her place in the hierarchy of wealth, visible yet invisible, always present but never acknowledged. At first, Grace viewed her employment as nothing more than a chance to earn stability, perhaps even send money back to the family she left behind. She had no intention of being anything more than a diligent worker in a house filled with staff, each of them operating in the shadows of the Whitmore's grand lifestyle. Yet from her first day, Grace noticed something unusual. Emily Whitmore, the heiress of the empire, looked pale, her movements sluggish, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. While the rest of the staff whispered that Emily was simply spoiled, staying up too late or indulging in excess, Grace sensed something deeper. Emily rarely joined the family for meals. When she did, her appetite seemed to vanish after only a few bites. Sometimes she clutched her stomach, excusing herself with a polite but pained smile. On other days, she avoided conversation altogether, retreating to her room under the pretense of headaches. It wasn't the behavior of a carefree teenager basking in privilege. It was the quiet suffering of someone whose body was betraying her, though no one seemed willing to admit it. The Whitmores did what families of their stature always did. They called in experts. White-coated professionals walked through the mansion's golden hallways, carrying briefcases filled with knowledge and confidence. But when they left, their diagnoses were vague, their prescriptions ineffective. Each failure chipped away at Richard Whitmore's composure, though he hid it behind stern expressions and clipped commands. For him, failure was not acceptable, yet it stared him in the face every time he looked at his daughter. In those early weeks, Grace kept her observations to herself. After all, what voice did a maid have in a mansion ruled by doctors and wealth? Still, she couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at her whenever she saw Emily struggling. Something inside her whispered that she was witnessing the beginning of a crisis no one else was truly seeing. She didn't know it yet, but her presence in the Whitmore household was about to alter the course of all their lives. And as the nights grew longer and Emily's condition worsened, Grace would soon discover that her role in this house was never meant to be silent service. It was meant to be the key no one else could find. The rhythm of the Whitmore mansion shifted as Emily's illness deepened. Where once the hallways echoed with piano practice, laughter, and the hurried footsteps of a teenager rushing from one social engagement to another, now there was silence. Doors that had always stood open were closed, curtains that once welcomed the sunlight were drawn, and the air of the house carried a weight of worry that even the staff could not ignore. Emily had been a bright girl, polite, studious, and curious, but her energy seemed to drain by the day. At first it was fatigue. She skipped a tennis lesson, then declined invitations to charity galas. Soon after, she struggled to climb the stairs to her room without pausing for breath. By the time weeks had passed, Emily was barely leaving her bed. Richard Whitmore summoned the most respected doctors in New York City. They arrived in sleek black cars, stepping into the mansion with an air of authority. It could be anemia, one said, prescribing iron supplements. Another insisted on a complex battery of blood tests. A third leaned toward a rare autoimmune disorder and prescribed a cocktail of medications. Yet none of their predictions held true. Emily grew weaker, not stronger. Her once bright skin became pale, her eyes shadowed, her voice fragile. Her mother's portrait, hanging in the dining room, seemed to watch over the family like a reminder of how fragile even the strongest bonds could be. Richard lost his wife years ago, and now he faced the possibility of losing his daughter too. He refused to show panic, yet the tension in his jaw, the sleepless nights in his study, and the curt orders he gave the staff betrayed him. Grace, from her quiet position in the background, observed what others missed. She noticed how Emily's hands trembled when she lifted a glass of water. She saw how the girl avoided certain dishes at dinner, her appetite disappearing the moment a particular scent reached her nose. Most of the staff dismissed these details as quirks, but Grace felt a knot of unease forming in her chest. One evening, while delivering fresh linens to Emily's room, Grace lingered at the doorway when she heard the girl's faint voice. "Dad," Emily whispered, her words barely audible. "Why can't they figure it out?" Richard sat by the bed, his broad frame dwarfed by the fragility of his daughter. "They will," he said firmly, though his eyes betrayed doubt. "I've hired the best, Emily. Someone will find the answer." "But what if they don't?" Emily's voice cracked. Tears welled in her eyes and she turned her face toward the window. "I'm so tired, Dad. I just want to feel normal again." Grace lowered her gaze, retreating silently before she was noticed. Yet Emily's words stayed with her, echoing in the quiet corners of her mind. Days blurred together. The doctors returned, adjusting medications, ordering new tests, shaking their heads in private conversations with Richard. "It's complex," one admitted. "Her symptoms overlap with so many conditions." Another warned, "If her body continues to weaken like this, her chances will narrow." Grace, despite having no authority, carried an instinctual awareness that something in Emily's daily life was worsening her condition. She began noticing patterns, how Emily's coughing fits worsened after certain meals, how her breathing seemed strained when specific cleaning agents were used in her room. Though she said nothing aloud, her growing awareness set her apart from the rest of the staff. At night, the mansion was unnervingly quiet. The city outside bustled with sirens, taxis, and neon lights, but inside every sound felt muffled. Grace would hear the faint creak of footsteps outside Emily's room as Richard paced, sleepless, or the hushed voices of doctors whispering down the hall. The decline was relentless. Emily no longer joined her father for dinner. Meals were brought to her room, but more often than not, left untouched. "She won't eat," the butler muttered one night, shaking his head. "The young lady is wasting away." Grace, folding linens in the laundry room, bit her lip. She wanted to argue, to explain that Emily's refusal was not rebellion or whim, but something deeper. But she knew her place. For now she stayed silent. Still, every passing day confirmed what Grace already felt in her bones. Something critical was being overlooked. The more the doctors prescribed, the weaker Emily became. And while others placed their trust in titles and wealth, Grace began to trust her own quiet instincts shaped by years of listening, watching, and remembering what her grandmother once told her. "If you pay close attention, The body tells its secrets. Those secrets were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. And Grace, though she did not yet realize it, was the only one willing to hear them. Long before Grace Johnson stepped into the Whitmore mansion, her life had been shaped by the heat, rhythm, and traditions of the American South. She was born in a small Georgia town where front porches doubled as gathering places, and neighbors shared what little they had. Summers were heavy with humidity, cicadas buzzing in the trees, and the scent of magnolia flowers drifting through the air. Winters were mild, but carried their own weight, reminding families of the struggles that came with limited resources and endless perseverance. Grace's childhood home stood on a dirt road, its wooden boards cracked by decades of weather. The screen door creaked, the floor groaned beneath footsteps, but inside was warmth, a kind of love not measured in wealth, but in presence. Her grandmother, Lillian Johnson, raised her after Grace's mother left in search of work she never truly found. Lillian was a midwife, respected by everyone in town, regardless of race or class. She was the kind of woman people trusted when no doctor was available, the one who sat by bedsides through long nights, whispering prayers and offering remedies crafted from roots, herbs, and years of observation. "Pay attention, Grace," her grandmother often said as they walked through fields collecting wild plants. "The body speaks if you're willing to listen." And healing doesn't always come from medicine alone. It comes from patience, care, and faith. Grace listened. She watched. And slowly, she absorbed those lessons, even when she didn't fully understand their importance. In school, Grace stood out, not for wealth or privilege, she had none of that, but for her persistence. She was the girl who stayed late to help teachers clean up, the one who took extra shifts at the diner after class to help with bills. While others planned college trips or dreamed of leaving town, Grace carried the responsibility of holding her small family together. She had a quiet strength, the kind that went unnoticed until it was most needed. When Lillian grew frail with age, Grace became her caretaker. The roles reversed, and it was Grace who stayed up through the night, watching over her grandmother as she once had been watched. On her last evening, Lillian held Grace's hand and whispered, "Child, you'll go further than this place. But don't ever forget what you carry. Your eyes see what others ignore. That will be your gift." Those words stayed with Grace as she boarded a bus north, clutching her grandmother's worn Bible and a small envelope of savings. The journey to New York was not glamorous. She arrived to the overwhelming rush of the city, skyscrapers blocking out the horizon, people hurrying past as if time itself were chasing them. Grace felt both invisible and exposed all at once. Finding work was harder than she imagined. Employers glanced at her accent, her clothes, her lack of connections, and dismissed her without hesitation. She slept in cheap rooms, sometimes skipping meals to make her money stretch. Yet she never allowed despair to root itself too deeply. She thought of her grandmother, of the resilience passed down to her, and she pressed forward. When the opportunity at the Whitmore estate finally came, Grace accepted without hesitation. The promise of steady pay, meals, and a place to belong, even temporarily, was more than she dared hope for. Still, the transition was jarring. She was thrust into a world of chandeliers, polished marble floors, and people who spoke in clipped, careful tones. Every detail of the mansion seemed designed to remind her she did not belong. Other staff members noticed her immediately. Some were kind, offering small tips to navigate the strict rules of the household. Others dismissed her with cold politeness, as if her presence was an inconvenience. Grace, however, kept her head down, focused on her tasks, and reminded herself why she was there: stability, survival, and perhaps the chance to send money home to relatives still struggling in Georgia. Yet, deep inside, she felt the weight of her grandmother's words echoing still. "Your eyes see what others ignore." Grace didn't know then that this very gift would soon draw her into a battle for Emily Whitmore's life, a battle where doctors, with all their titles, would fail, and where she, a maid from Georgia, would step forward with the strength no one else recognized. Her journey from the red clay roads of her hometown to the golden halls of Manhattan was not just a change of scenery. It was the quiet preparation for the role she had been destined to play, though she was not yet aware of it. Life inside the Whitmore mansion was governed by unspoken rules as much as by written instructions. Each staff member had their role, and any attempt to step beyond it was seen as a violation of the rigid hierarchy that protected the Whitmore's image. Grace Johnson, the new maid from Georgia, quickly learned that she was expected to remain invisible. Her job was to clean, polish, and serve, never to question, never to suggest, and certainly never to involve herself in matters beyond her station. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Dillard, embodied this hierarchy with every clipped command. She had served the Whitmores for over 2 decades and carried herself with the pride of someone who believed proximity to wealth elevated her above others. "Johnson," she barked one morning, pointing to a streak on a polished table. "Do it again." Perfection is the only standard here. Grace lowered her gaze, silently obeying, though the words stung. Other staff members were subtler in their disdain. They whispered in corners about her accent, her background, and her curious habit of paying too much attention to Emily's condition. "She thinks she's special," muttered one of the maids. "Always hovering around the girl like she knows better than the doctors." Their laughter was quiet, but Grace heard it. The tension grew sharper with Dr. Catherine Moore, the private nurse assigned to Emily. Dr. Moore was efficient, confident, and fiercely protective of her authority. She wore her white coat like armor, and every word she spoke carried the weight of certainty. Grace's quiet observations, though never confrontational, irritated her. One afternoon, as Grace brought fresh linens into Emily's room, she noticed the young girl grimacing at a tray of food. "Maybe something lighter would help," Grace said softly, her voice filled with concern. Dr. Moore turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "You are here to change the sheets, not to comment on medical care," she snapped. "Leave the health decisions to professionals." Grace felt her cheeks burn, but she swallowed her response. Emily, however, looked between them with uneasy eyes. "She's just trying to help," the girl murmured, but Dr. Moore would not relent. Later in the hallway, she confronted Grace directly. "You need to remember your place. This is not Georgia, and you are not your grandmother. Do your job and nothing more. The Whitmores are trusting me with their daughter's life, not you." The words cut deep, not only because they dismissed Grace's presence, but also because they touched on the memory of her grandmother, a wound still raw. Yet Grace said nothing. She knew arguing would only worsen her position. Still, the dismissal planted a seed of quiet defiance within her. Even Richard Whitmore himself contributed to the tension, though indirectly. He rarely addressed the staff unless necessary, but when he did, his tone was curt, his expectations clear. One evening, as Grace carried tea into the study, she overheard him speaking with Dr. Moore. "She's young, impressionable," Richard said, his voice heavy with worry. "Emily doesn't need distractions or false hope. Keep her focused on the treatments, and make sure the staff knows not to interfere." "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Moore replied smoothly. Grace left the tray without a word, but her heart pounded. She was not trying to give false hope. She was only noticing things others seemed to ignore. Yet now even the man whose daughter she wanted to help unknowingly stood against her. Despite the isolation, Emily began to draw closer to Grace. In the quiet moments when nurses were gone and the household hushed, Emily would whisper small confessions. "Sometimes I feel like no one really sees me," she admitted one night, her voice trembling. "The doctors talk around me. Dad avoids telling me the truth, and everyone else just looks at me like I'm a problem to solve. But you actually notice." Grace smiled gently, tucking the blanket around her. "I notice because you matter, Emily. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." It was in those words that the bond between them began to grow stronger, even as the rest of the staff worked to keep Grace in her place. What had started as subtle dismissals was becoming open hostility, a constant reminder that Grace was walking a dangerous line. But the more others tried to silence her, the more determined she became to listen to the quiet truths Emily's suffering revealed. And though Grace had no way of knowing, every step deeper into this conflict was leading her closer to the moment when silence would no longer be an option. The Whitmore mansion had grown quieter with each passing week, its grandeur muffled by worry and exhaustion. Emily remained confined to her room, the once vibrant teenager now a fragile shadow of herself. While doctors rotated in and out with stethoscopes and charts, their clinical words offered little comfort. What Emily craved was something far simpler, a presence that felt genuine, someone who would sit beside her not as a patient, not as an obligation, but as a girl who needed to be seen. Grace filled that void without ever intending to. What began as small moments, adjusting Emily's pillows, bringing her water, or quietly tidying the room, slowly grew into longer conversations. One evening, when the house had gone still, Emily whispered, "Grace, do you ever feel invisible? Like people look at you but don't actually see you?" Grace hesitated, then smiled softly. "More times than I can count," she admitted, "but I also learned that being invisible lets you see others more clearly. Maybe that's why I notice things most people don't." Emily studied her face, searching for sincerity. "That's exactly how I feel. Everyone keeps making decisions about me. What I should eat, what medicine I should take, what I should believe about my own body. But no one really listens." Grace reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from the girl's forehead. "Then let me listen," she said simply. It was the first time Emily's eyes filled not with fear, but with relief. From that night on, their bond deepened. Grace became more than a maid. She became Emily's confidant. On restless nights when sleep evaded her, Emily would whisper stories about the pressure of being a Whitmore. "Everyone thinks it's perfect," she confessed. "Private schools, vacations, designer clothes, but it feels like a cage. Dad expects me to carry the family name like it's a crown, but I don't want a crown. I just want to breathe." Grace nodded, understanding the weight of unspoken burdens. Though their lives were worlds apart, both knew the ache of expectations that left little room for choice. Sometimes Emily's vulnerability came in the form of silence. She would stare out the window at the city lights, her breathing shallow, her shoulders tense. Grace would sit beside her saying nothing, simply being there until Emily's hand reached for hers. The quiet connection spoke louder than any words. In moments of laughter, too rare but precious, Emily revealed glimpses of the girl she had been. One afternoon, Grace clumsily tripped over a rug while carrying fresh linens. Emily laughed, a soft, surprised sound that filled the room with warmth. "You're terrible at being graceful," Emily teased. "Maybe that's why my name is Grace," she replied, chuckling. "God has a sense of humor." Emily giggled, the sound quickly turning into a cough, but her smile lingered. For Grace, that small spark of joy felt like victory. Not everyone approved of their closeness. The staff whispered more than ever, and Dr. Moore grew increasingly tense. Yet Emily sought Grace's presence despite their disapproval. "Don't go when the nurse tells you to leave," Emily begged one night. "Please stay, you're the only one who makes this feel bearable." Grace stayed. She read aloud from novels Emily once loved, told stories of her grandmother's wisdom, and even hummed old lullabies from Georgia that carried the scent of summer nights and fireflies. Emily closed her eyes and said softly, "It feels like you bring a piece of peace with you. I don't know how, but you do." Grace felt her heart tighten at the words. She had come to New York for survival, never expecting to be needed in such a profound way. Yet here she was, offering comfort to the daughter of a billionaire, not with money or medicine, but with presence and care. And as Emily leaned on her more each day, Grace realized that their bond was no longer just a comfort in the storm. It was becoming a lifeline neither of them could do without. The days in the Whitmore mansion had settled into a rhythm of worry. Nurses moving briskly through hallways, doctors delivering updates filled with uncertainty, and Richard Whitmore pacing his study with an expression of controlled despair. Yet beneath the polished surface of order, Grace began to notice something the others ignored. Emily's body seemed to resist the very treatments meant to save her. It began with the medications. Bottles lined Emily's nightstand, their labels filled with names Grace could barely pronounce. Each time Emily swallowed the pills, her face twisted in discomfort. Her skin flushed, her stomach tightened, and her breathing grew uneven. Grace, standing quietly nearby with a glass of water, observed every detail. She never said a word, but inside her instincts churned. One afternoon, Grace found Emily slumped against her pillows. her face pale and clammy. The untouched tray of food beside her told a story Grace already suspected. "Emily," she said gently, brushing her hand across the girl's damp forehead, "you haven't eaten again." Emily's voice was weak but honest. "Every time I eat what they bring me, I feel worse. It's like my body is screaming, but no one hears it. They keep telling me it's just part of the treatment, but I don't believe that anymore." Grace hesitated. "What food makes you feel that way?" Emily looked at the tray and pointed. "That soup, the bread too, it feels like it burns from the inside out." Grace's eyes narrowed. She remembered how often Emily turned away from similar meals. That night, Grace made a quiet decision. When she was asked to bring dinner, she left certain items untouched, replacing them with simple foods she had seen Emily tolerate: plain rice, apples, water infused with lemon. Emily ate cautiously, and for the first time in days, she didn't grow weaker. The change was small but undeniable. Grace noted it silently, her heart racing at the possibility that something had been overlooked. The following evening, however, Dr. Moore entered as Emily pushed her tray aside. "She didn't eat again?" the nurse asked sharply. Emily glanced at Grace nervously, then shook her head. I wasn't hungry." Dr. Moore frowned, adjusting her glasses. "Skipping meals will only worsen your condition. You need strength to fight this." She gave Grace a pointed look before leaving the room. Emily exhaled shakily. "Thank you for not forcing me," she whispered. Grace smiled faintly. "I just want to see you comfortable." But inside, she knew this was more than comfort. It was a clue. Later that night, as the city lights painted patterns across the curtains, Grace sat alone in the staff quarters, replaying the day in her mind. Could it be the food, or perhaps the medications? Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. "If you pay close attention, the body tells its secrets." The next morning, Grace watched carefully as Emily took her prescribed pills. Within minutes, Emily's hands trembled, and her breathing grew shallow. Grace steadied her with a reassuring hand, masking her alarm. The pattern was too clear now to ignore. When the doctors arrived later that afternoon, Grace lingered by the doorway, her eyes on Emily. She wanted to speak, to tell them what she had seen. But the memory of Dr. Moore's scolding silenced her. She had no authority, no degree, no power. Who would believe a maid over a doctor? Still, the thought gnawed at her. She couldn't deny what her eyes had witnessed. Emily's decline wasn't just illness, it was being accelerated by the very things meant to heal her. Grace folded Emily's blankets and smoothed the sheets, her mind racing. Emily, sensing her unease, whispered, "You've noticed something, haven't you?" Grace met her gaze but hesitated. Finally, she nodded. "I don't think it's just the sickness, Emily. I think something they're giving you is making it worse." Emily's eyes widened, filled with both fear and hope. "Then promise me you won't stop paying attention. Please, even if no one else listens." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "I promise." It was in that quiet vow that the turning point began. Grace no longer saw herself as just a maid observing from the shadows. She was now part of a fight she had never expected, standing on the fragile edge between silence and action. And though she didn't yet know how dangerous that edge would become, her heart told her this was only the beginning. Grace's promise to Emily weighed on her like an invisible chain. Every day she watched, listened, and noted the small but undeniable connections between what Emily consumed and how her body reacted. The evidence grew too clear to ignore. Yet speaking those truths in a house ruled by hierarchy felt like stepping into a storm. Still, Grace could no longer keep silent. It began one morning when Dr. Moore entered Emily's room with another set of medications. Grace stood near the bed, holding a pitcher of water. Emily's lips trembled as she eyed the pills. "They make me feel worse," she murmured, her voice almost a plea. Grace hesitated, then said quietly but firmly, "Dr. Moore, I've noticed something. Each time Emily takes these, her breathing becomes shallow and she grows weaker. Maybe, Doctor." Moore turned sharply, cutting her off with a glare sharp enough to silence an entire room. "You are here to deliver water and change linens, not to offer medical analysis," she snapped. Her tone dripped with disdain. "Do not confuse kindness with knowledge, Miss Johnson. This is not your field." Grace flushed, her heart pounding, but before she could retreat, Richard Whitmore entered the room. His presence, towering and severe, filled the air with even more tension. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between them. Dr. Moore straightened. "Your maid seems to believe she is qualified to question medical treatments." Richard's gaze fell on Grace, cold and unyielding. "Is that true? Are you interfering with my daughter's care?" Grace swallowed, her palms damp. She wanted to shrink under his stare, but Emily's frail hand gripped hers, giving her strength. "Sir," Grace said, her voice steady though her knees trembled, "I'm not interfering. I've only noticed that some medicines seem to make Emily worse, not better. I thought you should know." Richard's jaw tightened. "And you base this conclusion on what? Your instincts?" "Yes, sir," Grace admitted softly. "On observation." The silence that followed felt endless. Richard's expression hardened. "You will not question the doctors again, do you understand? I pay them for their expertise, not you. Stick to your duties." His tone carried finality, the kind that left no room for argument. Grace lowered her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." As Richard left, Emily whispered urgently, "Don't stop, Grace, please." "You're the only one who believes me." Grace squeezed her hand, whispering back, "I promised I wouldn't and I won't." But the warning from Richard and the scorn of Dr. Moore hung over her like dark clouds. Word of the confrontation spread among the staff. Whispered conversations turned sharper, their laughter colder. "The maid thinks she's smarter than the doctors," one butler muttered. "She won't last long if she keeps this up." Even in the kitchen, where Grace once found a semblance of normalcy, the cook smirked and said, "Careful, honey. Around here, stepping out of line will cost you more than your job." That night, alone in the small staff quarters, Grace sat on the edge of her narrow bed, replaying every word. She knew she had risked everything, her employment, her stability, even her dignity, by speaking up. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Emily's pale face, heard her whispered plea. That image was enough to banish her fear. Emily needed her. That was the truth Grace could not turn away from, no matter how many doors slammed in her face. The clash had drawn clear lines. Richard trusted the doctors. Dr. Moore guarded her authority, and the staff mocked Grace's audacity. But none of them saw what Grace saw. None of them carried her grandmother's teachings, the ability to watch the small details others dismissed. And in her heart, Grace knew she could not let their disbelief silence her. She had stepped into the storm, and now there was no turning back. Grace learned quickly that open words would only earn her scorn. After the confrontation with Dr. Moore and Richard Whitmore, she understood that if she wanted to help Emily, she would have to do it quietly, without drawing attention. And so, her silent investigation began. Every day, Grace carried a small notebook in the pocket of her apron. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a place for housekeeping lists or schedules. In reality, it became her record of Emily's suffering. She noted the times of meals, the specific foods served, the medications administered, and Emily's reactions afterward. The pages slowly filled with observations others dismissed as coincidence, but which Grace recognized as patterns. Breakfast, oatmeal with milk. 10 minutes later, coughing fit, shortness of breath. Lunch, chicken soup, decline in energy, complained of burning in chest. Dinner, plain rice tolerated, no worsening symptoms. Grace's handwriting was small and neat, every detail recorded with care. At night, after the mansion grew still, she would retreat to the tiny staff quarters and compare her notes, tracing lines between cause and effect. Each discovery tightened the knot in her stomach. Her grandmother's lessons returned vividly in those quiet hours. She remembered sitting on the porch in Georgia, listening to Lillian explain how certain foods or herbs could either soothe or harm. "You don't need fancy machines to see what the body tells you," her grandmother had said. "All you need is patience." One evening, while Emily lay weak against her pillows, she whispered, "Grace, why are you always writing in that little book?" Grace hesitated, then pulled the notebook from her pocket and showed her. I'm keeping track of how you feel after each meal and medicine. I think there are patterns the doctors aren't noticing. Emily's tired eyes lit with a flicker of hope. So you believe me? I always did, Grace replied softly. And one day, I'll have enough proof that no one can deny it. Emily squeezed her hand. Thank you for listening. But secrecy was essential. If Dr. Moore discovered what she was doing, Grace knew the consequences would be severe. So she hid the notebook carefully, slipping it between folded linens or beneath the thin mattress in her room. Beyond her own records, Grace sought knowledge wherever she could. On her evenings off, she walked to the public library, blending in among students and researchers. She pored over medical texts, nutrition journals, and articles on allergies and intolerances. Though much of the scientific language was dense, she pushed through, writing notes in plain words she could understand. Certain food intolerances mimic illness. Environmental triggers, scents, chemicals, cause systemic reactions. Misdiagnosis common when symptoms overlap with autoimmune diseases. Grace copied these lines carefully, her mind racing with connections. Each page confirmed what her instincts already told her. Emily's illness was not random. It was a reaction, a cry from her body against something hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Grace grew sharper in her observations. She noticed how Emily's breathing worsened when fresh flowers filled her room, their perfumes heavy in the air. She saw how cleaning chemicals left Emily restless and coughing through the night. And when meals were stripped down to the simplest ingredients, Emily seemed, however briefly, to regain a sliver of strength. The staff continued to dismiss her. "Why do you stare at her plate like that?" one maid teased. "Planning to steal her leftovers?" Laughter followed, but Grace ignored it. Her focus remained on Emily, and on the truth she was piecing together in silence. She felt like a detective working in the shadows, guided not by authority, but by care. One night, as rain tapped against the windows and thunder rolled over Manhattan, Grace closed her notebook and whispered into the quiet, "I'm going to find what's hurting you, Emily. I swear I will." In that vow spoken only to herself, Grace crossed a threshold. She was no longer simply observing. She was preparing to challenge the very foundation of the Whitmore's world, armed only with patience, love, and a notebook filled with truths no one else would see. The storm Grace had been bracing for arrived on a grey afternoon. The mansion's atmosphere was thick with tension, the air itself heavy with fear. Emily had collapsed, her frail body trembling as she gasped for breath. Nurses rushed to her bedside, Dr. Moore barked orders, and Richard Whitmore's face hardened as he hovered over his daughter, powerless despite the army of professionals surrounding her. Grace stood just outside the circle of white coats, clutching her apron, her heart hammering in her chest. She had seen this before: Emily's sudden decline after meals, her worsening condition after medications. The notebook in Grace's pocket felt like it was burning against her skin. She knew the truth was there, scribbled in her careful observations. Yet now was not the time for pages. Now was the time for courage. Emily's breathing grew shallower. One of the doctors muttered, "Her body isn't responding. We may need to escalate." But his words broke into frantic whispers. Richard's voice cut through them, sharp and desperate. "Do whatever it takes. She cannot die here." Grace's eyes darted to the tray at the bedside, the remnants of a meal Emily had eaten hours earlier. Soup rich with cream, bread baked with additives, scents of polished silver and flowers thick in the room. She felt her grandmother's words echo like a command. If you pay close attention, the body tells its secrets. She stepped forward before fear could stop her. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice firm despite her shaking hands, "please listen to me. It's not working because something in this house is making her worse. The food, the flowers, the chemicals, they're poisoning her." The room froze. Dr. Moore turned, fury flashing in her eyes. "This is not the time for superstition and nonsense. Step back, Miss Johnson." But Emily's hand, trembling and weak, reached for Grace. "She's right," the girl whispered, her voice rasping. "Please, listen to her." Richard looked from his daughter to the maid, torn between disbelief and desperation. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his tone laced with both anger and fear. "Strip her environment down to the bare minimum," Grace replied quickly. Remove the food she reacts to, the perfumes, the flowers, the chemicals. Give her only plain water and simple meals I've seen her tolerate. Just for now, please, sir, I beg you. Nothing else has worked. What do you have to lose? The doctors protested, their voices clashing in outrage. This is absurd, dangerous, unscientific. But their protests sounded hollow against Emily's laboured breathing. Richard's fists clenched, his face caught between fury at the audacity of a maid and the undeniable truth that his daughter was slipping away under the care of the experts he trusted. Finally, his voice cracked through the chaos. Do it. Do what she says. Dr. Moore's face went pale. Mr. Whitmore, I said do it, he thundered, his authority shaking the walls. The staff scrambled to remove the food, the flowers, even the air fresheners hidden in the corners of the room. Grace guided Emily's head gently, whispering reassurance. Within hours, the faintest change appeared. Emily's breathing steadied. The colour in her cheeks, though still pale, no longer drained away completely. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was improvement, the first in weeks. Richard stood frozen, staring at his daughter, as if witnessing a miracle he could not comprehend. His gaze flicked to Grace, unreadable, but heavy with something he had never shown her before. Respect, mixed with suspicion. Emily clutched Grace's hand with surprising strength for her condition. You saved me, she whispered, tears brimming in her tired eyes. Grace shook her head softly. No, Emily. You saved yourself. I just listened when no one else did. For the first time since her arrival in the mansion, Grace felt the tide shift. She had taken a risk that could have cost her everything, but instead it carved a new path, one where her voice could no longer be dismissed so easily. But deep inside, Grace knew this was only a fragile victory. The storm was not over. It had only just begun. For the first time in weeks, there was a faint glow of hope in the Whitmore mansion. Emily's breathing had steadied, her colour no longer as ghastly as before. The simple changes Grace had insisted upon, plain food, clean air, the removal of chemical scents, were working. Yet hope in a household like this was never free. It came tangled with suspicion, whispers, and the weight of reputation. News of Emily's fragile improvement spread quickly, but so did the story of how it came about. The maid intervened, one of the kitchen staff whispered in disbelief. She told Mr. Whitmore what to do, and he listened. The words carried both shock and mockery. For many, the idea of a maid outshining trained doctors was unthinkable. Richard himself struggled to reconcile the change. He stood at Emily's bedside, his expression unreadable. You do seem better, he admitted, his voice heavy with caution. But this doesn't mean we abandon proper medicine. He glanced at Grace, his eyes narrowing. Do not mistake a coincidence for a cure. Grace kept her tone humble. I don't claim to have cured her, sir. I only noticed what seemed to make her worse. Doctor? Moore, however, was less restrained. Her pride, already wounded, ignited into fury. This is dangerous, she declared to Richard in the hallway. We cannot let a maid dictate medical care. If society learns of this, your reputation will be in shambles. They will say you entrusted your daughter's health to superstition. Richard pinched the bridge of his nose, his jaw clenched. And yet, Catherine, my daughter breathed easier today than she has in weeks. Are you going to deny what I saw with my own eyes? Dr. Moore faltered but pressed on. If this gets out, the press will have a field day. Investors will question your judgment. Your empire could be shaken by scandal. As if her words summoned it, rumours began to seep into the outside world. A journalist, tipped off by an anonymous source among the staff, began circling the story. Billionaire's daughter gravely ill, unorthodox treatment rumoured inside Whitmore home. Headlines teased whispers of desperation, suggesting that Richard Whitmore was letting unqualified hands meddle with his daughter's care. At the breakfast table, Richard slammed the newspaper down, the bold letters glaring up at him. They think I've lost control, he growled, that I've allowed my household to fall into chaos. His eyes cut toward Grace, who stood silently at the edge of the room, her heart pounding. I never wanted attention, she said quietly. I only wanted Emily to breathe easier. That may be true, Richard snapped, but the world doesn't care about intentions. They care about appearances. And right now, this looks like weakness. Emily, who had been listening from her wheelchair, spoke with surprising force. Dad, she helped me. Don't pretend she didn't. Maybe the world should know that money and doctors aren't always enough. Richard's stern mask cracked for a moment, his eyes softening as he looked at his daughter. But then he shook his head. The world isn't kind to stories like that, Emily. They twist them until they ruin everything. The household grew colder in the following days. Staff members whispered louder, their disdain for Grace no longer subtle. She's playing with fire, one said. When the doctors prove her wrong, she'll be out on the street. Grace carried the weight of their words, but when she entered Emily's room and saw the girl smile faintly, her resolve hardened. Emily was improving, not cured, but improving, and that truth mattered more than gossip. Still, Grace couldn't ignore the storm gathering around her. She had stepped into a place she was never meant to stand, and the resistance she now faced was greater than before. The doctors doubted her, the staff mocked her, the world outside threatened scandal, and Richard himself teetered between gratitude and fear. But every time Emily whispered, "Don't leave me, Grace," she knew retreat was no longer an option. She had taken the first risk. Now she had to endure the consequences. Richard Whitmore had built his life on control. Every deal, every investment, every boardroom decision had been calculated, weighed, and mastered. Failure was something that happened to other men, not to him. Yet now, as he watched his daughter, his only child, grow weaker in his own home, the illusion of control crumbled. He sat alone in his study late one night, the city skyline glowing through tall windows. The glass of untouched scotch at his desk trembled slightly in his hand. Headlines from earlier that day replayed in his mind, "Billionaire's daughter still ill, despite world-class treatment." His empire, his reputation, and his pride all seemed fragile compared to the quiet sound of Emily's labored breathing echoing down the hall. Grace's words haunted him too. A maid, someone he had barely noticed when she entered his home, had stood before him and dared to challenge the professionals he paid fortunes to. And worse, she had been right. Emily had improved under her suggestions, however unorthodox. It unsettled him, stirring feelings he could neither dismiss nor fully accept. The door creaked, and Grace stepped quietly inside, holding a tray with tea. "You didn't touch dinner," she said softly. Richard didn't look at her. "I'm not hungry." She placed the tray on the table and hesitated before speaking again. "I know you think I overstepped, but I couldn't watch her suffer in silence." His gaze snapped to hers, sharp but weary. "Do you know what it costs a man like me to admit that I can't fix something? To accept that all the money, all the influence I've built, means nothing when my daughter looks at me with fear in her eyes?" His voice cracked, raw with vulnerability he rarely showed. Grace stepped closer, her own voice calm. "I may not understand the weight of your world, sir, but I do know what it feels like to stand by someone you love and feel powerless. My grandmother taught me that sometimes healing comes not from control, but from humility, from listening, even when the answers aren't what we expect." Richard's eyes softened, though pride still held him back. "Humility," he repeated bitterly, "a word Wall Street chews up and spits out. I've built an empire by never bowing, never yielding." "Yet here you are," Grace said gently, "watching your daughter fight for her life. Maybe this battle isn't about power. Maybe it's about love." The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Richard turned away, staring at the flickering lights outside. "Emily, she reminds me of her mother, strong-willed, stubborn, but so full of light. When my wife passed, I swore I'd protect Emily from everything, but I couldn't protect her from this." Grace placed a steady hand on the desk, her voice low but firm. "You're protecting her now, not by controlling, but by allowing someone else to see what you couldn't. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." For the first time, Richard didn't recoil from her words. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest for months. "Do you realize what you've done, Miss Johnson? You've made me question everything I've ever believed about strength." Grace offered a faint smile. Maybe strength isn't about standing tallest, Mr. Whitmore. Maybe it's about knowing when to bend. The conversation ended there, but its echo lingered long after Grace left the room. Richard sat in the quiet, staring at the untouched tea, replaying her words again and again. He had dismissed her as a maid, an outsider. Yet she had given him something no doctor, no businessman, no ally had managed to offer: perspective. And as he rose from his chair to check on Emily, Richard realized with startling clarity that perhaps the greatest awakening of his life was happening not in a boardroom, but within the walls of his own home. The days following Richard's awakening carried a new weight inside the mansion. He was no longer blind to Grace's observations, though he still guarded his pride carefully. Emily's health remained fragile, but there was undeniable progress. Her strength lingered a little longer, her breathing was steadier, and her spirit flickered with cautious hope. Yet whispers of scandal still haunted Richard's reputation. He needed proof, something undeniable that would silence both critics and his own doubts. It was Grace who planted the seed. One evening, while adjusting Emily's blanket, she said softly, "Sir, I believe what Emily suffers from isn't something doctors have been looking for. It could be rare intolerances, things hidden in food, in scents, in medicines themselves. But without tests, all we have are suspicions." Richard narrowed his eyes, considering her words. Tests? The best specialists have already done every test imaginable. Not like this, Grace replied carefully. Not looking for what doesn't fit their expectations. Sometimes the smallest details hold the biggest answers. For the first time, Richard didn't dismiss her outright. Later that night, he called in a younger physician he trusted, one not bound by pride or reputation, Dr. Aaron Lewis, a specialist known for his curiosity and willingness to explore unconventional paths. When Dr. Lewis arrived, his manner was less rigid than the others. He listened patiently as Richard explained the situation, then turned his attention to Grace. "I understand you've noticed patterns others missed. Tell me what you've seen." Grace hesitated, her palms damp. She had never spoken so openly in front of a doctor, but the urgency in Emily's tired eyes gave her courage. She opened her notebook, pages filled with weeks of observations, and began. "Each time she eats foods with dairy or certain additives, she declines, burning in the chest, coughing, weakness. When she avoids them, she improves. Perfumed flowers and cleaning chemicals trigger the same response. Even some of her prescribed medicines make her worse." Dr. Lewis flipped through the notebook, his brow furrowing with interest. "This is remarkably detailed," he said. "You've documented things most would overlook." Dr. Moore scoffed from the corner, arms crossed. "Are we seriously entertaining this? Notes from a maid?" "But, Doctor—" Lewis ignored her. He turned to Richard. "With your permission, I'd like to run specific allergy and intolerance tests. They aren't standard in cases like this, but given what I'm seeing, they could reveal what's truly happening." Richard hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Do it." The tests began the next morning. Vials of blood were taken, samples analyzed, every possible allergen considered. Grace stayed close to Emily, whispering encouragement as needles pricked her fragile skin. Emily clutched her hand and whispered, "I'm scared, Grace. What if nothing shows up? What if it's all in my head like they say?" Grace squeezed her fingers gently. "It's not in your head, Emily. Your body's been speaking all along. Now we're finally letting someone listen." Days later, the results arrived. Dr. Lewis laid the papers on Richard's desk, his expression serious but steady. "She has severe intolerances to certain foods, dairy proteins, gluten, and specific chemical preservatives. Additionally, she's hypersensitive to artificial fragrances. These reactions can mimic more dangerous illnesses and explain why traditional treatments made her worse. This wasn't a mystery disease. It was her environment attacking her body." Richard's hands trembled as he read the results. He looked at Grace, his voice low. "You saw what no one else did." Grace shook her head humbly. "I just paid attention." Emily, tears streaming down her cheeks, whispered, "So I wasn't crazy. There was always something wrong." Dr. Lewis smiled reassuringly. "You weren't crazy, Emily. "You were unheard. Now we have a plan to protect you, and with the right care you can recover." Relief swept through the room like a cleansing wind. For Richard, it was confirmation that his empire of wealth had failed him, but humility had saved his daughter. For Emily, it was proof that her suffering had not been imagined. And for Grace, it was validation that her eyes, her instincts, and her heart had uncovered the truth. The mansion, once heavy with despair, now carried a fragile but undeniable light. The results from Dr. Lewis had transformed uncertainty into clarity. For the first time in months there was direction, a plan, a path forward. Yet recovery was never just about removing allergens or changing diets. Healing demanded more than medicine, and Grace understood this better than anyone. Emily's body was still weak, her steps unsteady, her nights often restless. But her spirit was stirring, and Grace knew she had to nurture that as carefully as the doctors tended to her physical health. She began to weave small rituals into Emily's days, fragments of comfort and resilience drawn from her own upbringing. In the mornings, Grace opened the curtains to let in sunlight, filling the room with warmth instead of gloom. She brought Emily simple breakfasts, apples, plain rice, herbal teas, and sat with her until she finished. "Slow and steady," Grace would say with a smile. "Healing isn't a race." Emily often laughed softly at her words. "You sound more like a teacher than a maid." "Maybe both," Grace replied gently. "My grandmother always said healing the body is only half the journey. Healing the mind makes the other half possible." At night, when fears returned like shadows, Emily whispered, "What if I get sick again? What if it comes back worse?" Grace held her hand and answered, "Then we face it together. Fear only wins if we let it keep us frozen." These moments stitched trust into something deeper than companionship. Emily began to lean on Grace not just for comfort, but for strength. When her father visited, she spoke with more confidence. When doctors asked questions, she answered clearly instead of shrinking into silence. It was as though Grace's quiet resilience was flowing into her. Richard noticed the change too. One evening, he found Grace reading aloud from a novel at Emily's bedside. His daughter, though pale, was smiling, genuine, unforced. Richard lingered in the doorway, struck by the scene. Later, when Emily had drifted to sleep, he said quietly, "She listens to you in a way she doesn't with anyone else." Grace lowered her gaze. "She just needs someone who doesn't treat her like a case or an obligation." Richard studied her for a long moment before admitting, "Perhaps I've forgotten how to do that." Beyond the walls of the mansion, the media frenzy continued. Yet inside, Emily's recovery was no longer measured solely by charts and test results. It was measured in laughter, in longer conversations, in the way her color slowly returned. Dr. Lewis guided her treatment, but it was Grace who guided her spirit. One afternoon, as Grace helped Emily take a few steps across her room, Emily looked up and said, "Do you realize what you've done? You've given me back more than my health. You've given me back myself." Grace's eyes softened. "No, Emily. That was always inside you. I just helped you see it again." The bond between them now resembled something far beyond patient and caretaker. It was like the bond of sisters, forged not by blood, but by shared struggle and trust. Grace had entered the Whitmore mansion as a servant, but Emily now looked at her as an anchor, someone who had held her steady when the world threatened to drown her. Healing was still a journey, with setbacks and fragile victories. But Emily no longer faced it alone, and as she leaned on Grace's wisdom and strength, the mansion itself seemed to breathe easier. For the first time in months, hope was no longer a fragile whisper. It was a presence, steady and alive, carried in the quiet resilience of a woman who had once been overlooked, and in the restored spirit of a girl who had finally begun to believe she could live again. The Whitmore mansion no longer carried the same suffocating weight it once had. The walls that had echoed with fear and hopelessness now held softer sounds. Emily's tentative laughter, Richard's voice gentler than before, and Grace's quiet encouragement. It was as if the house itself had shifted, adapting to the new rhythm of recovery. Emily's strength grew gradually. She was no longer confined entirely to her bed. With Grace's patient support, she began to walk short distances, her hands trembling but determined. "One step at a time," Grace repeated like a mantra. "Don't look at how far you have to go. Just focus on the step in front of you." Emily often leaned against her voice laced with gratitude. "You make me believe I can do things I was too scared to try. Before, everyone looked at me like I was fragile glass, but you see me as capable." Grace smiled warmly. "Because you are. You've just forgotten how strong you really are." Richard watched these interactions with quiet awe. For weeks, he had stood at a distance, torn between admiration and pride. But slowly he began to accept what had become undeniable. Grace was no longer just a maid in his house. She had become an essential part of his daughter's healing and, by extension, a vital part of his family. One evening, after dinner, Richard approached Grace in the hallway. His tone was softer than she had ever heard before. "Miss Johnson," he began, "I want to thank you. What you've done for Emily, I cannot measure it in words or wealth." Grace lowered her gaze respectfully. "I only did what I knew was right, sir." Richard studied her with an intensity that carried more sincerity than command. "No, you did more. You reminded me what it means to truly see someone, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be cared for. That is something I forgot long ago." He paused, then added, "From now on, I want you to be involved in every decision about Emily's care, not as a servant, but as someone whose judgment I trust." The weight of those words stunned Grace. She had come to this mansion expecting only to clean floors and serve meals, yet here she stood, entrusted with a responsibility that transcended all boundaries of class and station. The staff noticed the shift, too. Where once they had mocked and dismissed her, now they treated her with a newfound respect. Conversations stopped when she entered the room, not with derision, but with acknowledgement. The same maids who had whispered cruelly before now asked, "Miss Johnson, what would Emily prefer for her meals?" The butler, once aloof, began deferring to her judgment when preparing the household schedule. Emily basked in the transformation as well. She no longer felt alone in her battle. "It feels like the house finally listens to me," she said one afternoon, leaning back on her pillows. "But really, they're listening to you, Grace." Grace chuckled softly. "Maybe they're just learning to see you the way you deserve to be seen." Beyond the walls, society still whispered, but Richard was no longer consumed by appearances. At a small gathering of close associates, he spoke openly. "Wealth bought me doctors, but not answers. It was compassion and observation that saved my daughter. And I will never forget who gave us both." The words left his guests speechless, for humility from Richard Whitmore was rarer than gold. Grace, hearing of his speech later, felt her chest tighten with a mix of pride and disbelief. She had not sought recognition, yet it was arriving at her doorstep in ways she could never have imagined. And as Emily's health continued to steady, Grace realized something profound. She had not only earned a place in this house, but she had helped reshape it. The Whitmore family had been built on wealth and walls. Now, through struggle and care, it was learning to be built on something deeper: trust, humility, and love. Spring returned to New York with a gentleness that seemed to mirror Emily's recovery. The mansion, once heavy with silence and despair, now opened its windows to sunlight and fresh air. For the first time in months, laughter echoed faintly through its halls. Emily, though still regaining her strength, walked slowly through the gardens, her arm steady on Grace's. Each step was a reminder that survival was no longer a dream, but a reality. Richard watched his daughter with quiet wonder. The man who had once placed his faith entirely in wealth and power now stood humbled, knowing that his empire had not saved Emily. Compassion had. He approached Grace one morning as she arranged flowers in a vase, careful to choose those without heavy fragrances. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, his voice carrying both pride and humility, "but you've done what no doctor could. You didn't just help Emily heal, you helped me see life differently." Grace smiled softly, her hands stilling on the vase. "I didn't do it alone, sir. Emily fought every step of the way. I just listened." Emily, overhearing from the doorway, chimed in with a grin. "She's being humble again, Dad. Don't believe her too much." Their laughter filled the room, a sound none of them had thought they'd hear again. The world outside soon caught up with the truth. When Richard finally spoke publicly, he surprised society with words no one expected. Standing at a charity gala, he declared, "My daughter's life was saved not by privilege but by humility and care. It was a woman in my home, unseen by most, who showed us the truth." Let this be a reminder. Wisdom does not always wear a title, and heroes do not always come from where we expect. The audience murmured in astonishment, some applauding, others struck into silence. Grace, seated quietly in the back, lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with the attention. But Emily reached for her hand under the table, whispering, "You deserve every word of this." In the weeks that followed, Grace's role in the Whitmore household changed permanently. No longer just a maid, she became a trusted advisor in Emily's care and a valued member of the family's inner circle. The staff who once mocked her now sought her guidance with respect. For Grace, it was never about recognition. It was about knowing that her grandmother's teachings, her instincts, and her courage had mattered. One evening, as Emily sat beside her father by the fire, she turned to Grace. "You're part of this family now. Nothing changes that." Grace's throat tightened with emotion. She thought of her small home in Georgia, of her grandmother's weathered hands guiding her through fields, whispering wisdom. She whispered back, almost to herself, "If you allow, I will help. That's all I ever wanted, to help." Richard nodded, his expression uncharacteristically tender. "And you did. More than you know." The mansion glowed differently now, not because of its chandeliers or marble floors, but because of the quiet resilience that had filled its walls. Grace had arrived as a servant, invisible to those around her. She remained as something far greater, a symbol of humility, courage, and the truth that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power. And though Emily's journey was not over, she faced the future with strength, no longer crushed by the weight of loneliness. With her father beside her and Grace at her side, she knew she was no longer unseen. This story, born in the heart of one family, became a reminder for all. Healing is not only science, not only money, but love, patience, and the courage to listen when others will not. Before we close, remember, subscribe to this channel to follow more stories of resilience and unexpected heroes. And don't stop here. Click the video on your screen to continue this journey with us, where another life-changing story awaits.